Last month, we tasted two coffee varieties, a pacamara and a gesha, that were both produced on the same coffee estate in El Salvador. For this month, we're going to taste a new coffee variety, but instead of tasting two varieties produced on the same farm, we're going to be tasting the same variety produced on multiple farms that are all located in the same general region of Colombia. I'm also really excited about this month's tasting because, as you can see, we have a special guest today. I'm very happy to welcome Russ Durfee to the tasting this month. Russ is Passenger's head of roasting and quality control, and he's also currently the only member of our team who is a certified Q grader. So I thought maybe before we start talking about the coffees, maybe you'd like to share a little bit with our members about Q grader certification and how that process works.
Yeah, sure. So the Q grader certification is given by a nonprofit organization called the Coffee Quality Institute. One of the primary goals of CQI, as we call it for short, is to build a network of cuppers that are buying green coffee that are calibrated around sort of a single idea of how we define quality. To sort of create a common language of quality around agreed upon standards. The idea for that sort of coming from if you are a producer bringing your green coffee to various markets, that ideally somebody grading and scoring a coffee in one part of the world would grade it and score it similarly in another part of the world. This is especially important because when we grade coffee for quality, it has a large impact on what producers end up getting paid for that coffee.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. And I think in a slightly different way, hopefully a little more casual way, because this is a non-professional context. The community that we're building with cup tasters is a similar network,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
About shared tasting and probably over time a little bit of calibration as we're tasting the same coffees as members are, and over time kind of sharing some notes. So let's talk a little bit about the coffees that we've chosen for this month's tasting, starting with the variety of the coffees. So we said both of these coffees, we each have our own set on the table today, are examples of a variety called Pink Bourbon. And Pink Bourbon is kind of an interesting variety, partly because while it has this great name, Pink Bourbon, at least as far as I know, there's still a fair amount of uncertainty regarding exactly what it is. So if we look back a few years, at least within the history of our sourcing program at Passenger, 2-3 years ago, at least in my memory, we started to get the first few samples that were described as Pink Bourbon from Colombia. So going back to maybe 2017, 2018, we would get a couple of these samples. It was kind of mysterious. It sounded very beautiful. Ooh, Pink Bourbon. But in the current time, there has been an explosion of Pink Bourbon in the regions of Colombia that we are most sort of actively involved. And there's a couple reasons for this. But backing up the train, let's talk about the difficulty of this variety that's called Pink Bourbon and the uncertainty that surrounds it. So the name Pink Bourbon refers to two things. The pink part just refers to the fact that the fruit of this particular coffee variety, it ripens to pink rather than red or yellow, which would be more common kind of colors of the coffee fruit. And so that's the pink part. The Bourbon part refers to the fact that many have thought that the origin of this specific variety is a mutation of Bourbon varieties in similar parts of Colombia. So the idea of if you have maybe a yellow Bourbon tree and a red Bourbon tree, you have some type of a cross that happens sort of spontaneously in the field, and then it makes sense that the color of the fruit might be somewhere in between, right? Pink Bourbon. As far as I know, it has never been sort of conclusively proven by genetic testing that Pink Bourbon is necessarily a Bourbon at all. And there are a variety of other theories that are definitely kind of moving around throughout specialty coffee regarding what this coffee variety actually is. Some people say it's some type of landrace variety from Ethiopia. Other people say it's some type of a mutation of the Colombia variety. There's a lot of theories, but as far as I know, at least at this stage, that's not been conclusively established. What we do know, and part of the reason why Pink Bourbon is having such a moment in Colombia right now, is that the cup quality potential of Pink Bourbon is really, really high. So I know certainly in our experience cupping lots of samples here at Passenger, many of the most memorable and delicious coffees that we've tasted from Colombia over the last couple of years have been Pink Bourbons. There's just a lot of potential for flavor complexity, sweetness, acidity, all the nice things that we look for in a really special micro lot from Colombia. So quality potential, really high. Additionally, the feedback that we get from producers that we work with in Colombia is that from a producer's standpoint, in addition to that quality potential, which hopefully translates to very high prices, it also has the benefit, generally speaking, of being high yielding. So that's really good if you have more fruit that you can sell. And then additionally, what we've heard is that this variety tends to be quite disease resistant as well. So at the end of the day, if you have a coffee variety that's kind of new, buyers are asking about it because they've cupped Pink Bourbon and been really impressed by the quality, and it's high yielding and it's disease resistant. If you're a coffee farmer, you definitely want to plant more Pink Bourbon, and many of the farmers that we've talked to, that's exactly what they're doing. So that is sort of the story so far as I know so far with Pink Bourbon. At which point I think that we can actually start talking about the coffees themselves. So why don't we go ahead and start with this coffee, which is kind of coffee number A, I think, in this month's tasting, the Divino Nino Pink Bourbon. So first of all, we love this coffee because it's from Divino Nino. And for anyone who's sort of been aware and connected to Passenger's sourcing program over the last few years, Divino Nino will likely be a very familiar name. It's the name of one of our foundational partnerships. There's a coffee on the foundational menu at Passenger called Divino Nino, which we endeavor to always have on the menu. And over time, we started with that foundational lot, but gradually we have worked with our sourcing partners in Colombia and with this community of farmers that live near this tiny town called Divino Nino to increasingly sort of identify and source specific lots to add to our other menus, whether it's the education lot menu, whether it's the reserve lot menu, that are separatable and sort of provide a slightly more nuanced, expansive picture of the beautiful coffees of this region and this producing community that we are so proud to work with. So what happened with Divino Nino Pink Bourbon, during that time when so many farmers in the region were planting more Pink Bourbon, our sourcing partners at Osido, who have a purchasing point in this part of Colombia and are really, really important partners of ours on the sourcing side, they were observing more and more of these small deliveries from very small family farms that had been separated and kept separate as Pink Bourbon deliveries. So often the volume was too small to justify becoming a micro lot, but the quality was often really high such that they didn't necessarily want to fold it into a community lot with lots of other varieties. So what to do when you have this small delivery, but the quality is really good? So what they did was they created what I kind of clumsily refer to as a single variety community blend. I'm not quite sure what to name it, just because it is kind of a rare and unusual thing to have a blend, meaning coffees coming from multiple farms in the same small community, but a variety separation. So many community lots in Colombia, as you know, they're field blends. They include lots of different varieties because that is generally how coffee is cultivated on a lot of these farms. But to have something like this, which is a portrait of a community, but also a separation focusing on this single variety, is a really unique thing. It's also something we've done with the gesha variety at Divino Nino. We have a lot that fits that description on the menu as well. But that's more or less the story here, where small deliveries have been blended together and we're able to add it to the menu in addition to the other Divino Nino coffees. So I've been talking a lot. Let's taste this coffee and kind of see how it's presenting. And I'm going to defer to you to tell me, thinking as a Q grader, thinking as a coffee taster, what are sort of the primary qualities that are jumping out at you with Divino Nino Pink Bourbon today? I'm so happy to have another taster at the table for this.
Yeah, so there's just like kind of initially just really nice sort of cooked fruit, maybe mild cherry, and a nice acidity, but also a good sort of, a good depth of sweetness behind it.
Yeah, I get a lot of cherry as well. I think the way that like cherry is a great note for this coffee because I think it captures something about not only the sweetness and a sort of discernible flavor, but it also connects with that acidity, you know? So it's kind of sweet and bright in a way that's reminiscent of a cherry. I also get a little bit of citrus in this coffee as well, which I really enjoy. It's quite bright. I think the base for me also has a lot of kind of tea-like qualities.
Definitely, especially sort of in the mouthfeel a little bit, sort of like green tea, almost a little bit astringency from like in the finish.
Absolutely. And you know, I think the thing as we're tasting this, I mean, it's the same variety and we're going to talk about the second coffee very soon here, but you know, with the same variety being featured in both coffees this month, it makes us sort of want to explore some of the other variables. So it's often been a theme in the Cup Tasters membership so far in season 1 that we're always looking for some type of contrast or sometimes multiple contrasts that tasting these particular 2 coffees kind of brings to light, or at least gives us an opportunity to think about as we're tasting. And so if it's not the variety, I think the question is, what are some of the other variables that are maybe kind of being brought out in this sort of comparative tasting? And I think that there's a couple of possible answers there. But as we were talking about Divino Nino Pink Bourbon, one of the first things we could talk about is sort of the difference in farm context, right? So with this being a community blend of the same variety, what that means is there's a representation of lots of little farms and there's lots of different variables that potentially are going to be slightly different in all of those different farms. So usually each small, producer or family that kind of is doing the processing of coffee on a very small scale in these farms, they're all going through the same general steps, but the particulars might be a little different. It's also true that there could even be small differences in microclimate just in different parts of that kind of Suaza region that Divino Nino is located in. So little parts of that could absolutely come into play. So I think if we look at that and then we talk about the second coffee from Marleni and Bacci, what we're talking about is a shift from a community single variety blend to a single variety lot from one small farm. And I think we can absolutely start kind of tasting this coffee. I'll continue to share a little bit more about Marleni as well, because I want to make sure we get that contrast while the coffee's at a great temperature. So in addition to the fact that we're talking about a difference between multiple farms and a single farm, I think if we take a close look at our bags of coffee as well, we're going to see another kind of interesting contrast. And that is the Divino Nino Pink Bourbon lot is from the 2020 harvest, whereas the Marleni and Bacci lot is from the 2018 harvest. So we're also tasting, as we taste these coffees, an expression of 2 completely different harvest years, and not even successive harvest years, but 2 years apart. And tasting this Marleni coffee, we're talking about a coffee that's 4 years from harvest, right, which is really, really interesting. Maybe before we talk any more about this coffee, do you want to say a little bit about why that's interesting and maybe why it's a bit of a lovely surprise that this Marleni is so sweet and bright?
Yeah, I think the short answer is that usually a coffee that would be 4 years out from harvest would start to not only significantly drop off in some of the attributes that we really cherish, sweetness, acidity, those things would usually be dropping off. But by 4 years, if not well before, it would probably go further than that and sort of start to exhibit cardboardy or papery tastes, but one of the things we've done for a very long time at Passenger is freeze all of our green coffee. And part of the reason that we do that is because when you freeze the green coffee, we're able to sort of lock in all those flavors, and that quality is sort of equal to the day it was delivered to us in 2018. And the freezer allows us to just sort of maintain that and be able to re-present these coffees again in contexts like these.
Yeah, I think sometimes when I try to describe some of the things, and there are some other roasting companies around the country and around the world that are also freezing coffee. I think Passenger is still fairly unique in terms of the scale that we're freezing coffee, in that every pound of every coffee on our menu is maintained in deep freeze storage. And we spend a lot of time and energy doing that, but I think one of the really exciting things about that is we are able to offer tastings like this, that really, they almost present coffees in a more archival way as opposed to a seasonal way. There's nothing wrong with a seasonal menu. There's a lot of roasting companies that do a really amazing job with that. But as someone who has previously worked for a roasting company that had more of that type of model, as a green coffee buyer, you're always very, very stressed about the ticking clock that is on those green coffees when they arrive. So the question that's in your mind is, how many weeks and hopefully months do I have before this coffee starts to exhibit flavors that we would describe as fade or age? Where, like you're saying, that sweetness and bright, juicy acidity that we love in the coffee when it arrives starts to slowly kind of drop off and be replaced by kind of dusty, flat, maybe sawdusty flavors, which are just not as pleasant, especially when you're roasting coffees fairly lightly at a relatively light development. You really want coffees that are going to be exhibiting all those beautiful, bright, fresh flavors. So moving back to these coffees, this coffee from 2018, I mean, this was truly one of the first sort of pink Bourbon lots that I'm aware Passenger being offered from this part of Colombia. And Marlene Imbachi is a really remarkable producer. Her farm is relatively small. As far as I know, pink Bourbon is the main, if not the only variety that she cultivates on her farm. And Passenger at different times has had, I think, 3 to 4 consecutive harvests from Marlene's farm at certain times, all on our menu at the same time, which is similar to this in that you're presenting sort of, a picture of time and place at a very, very specific location 4 years in a row. Here, it's slightly different parts of Colombia, slightly different communities, a community lot as opposed to a single producer lot. But I think certainly as we're recording this, there's at least 2 other harvests of Marlene's coffee on the reserve lot menu right now. And, if we could have those in the box as well, we would, because it's a really interesting sort of tasting experience to taste those as well. They're completely different than this coffee. Yeah. There are shared qualities, but they're very different. And so moving back to the contrast that we're getting here, I think we have the potential contrast of slightly different parts of Colombia. So Divino Nino is located in the Suaza region. Marlene's farm is located near San Agustin, which is about, depending on road conditions, about a 2-hour drive to the west, moving towards the border with Cauca in Colombia. So slightly different region, but still within the general Huila region, right? You have that contrast. But certainly when we taste this, the question that is in my mind is, man, wouldn't it be fascinating if we could have also tasted the Divino Nino coffee from 2018 as well? Because I think then you would have this contrast which would say, were there broad conditions of weather, of rain, of the harvest season in Colombia a little more broadly that year, that this coffee from 2018 is reflective of? Maybe less about the specific farm and more about general kind of weather patterns that affected the coffee harvest throughout Huila. Maybe, maybe not. But these are definitely sort of the questions that are in our mind kind of when we taste these coffees. And speaking of which, let's talk a little more about how the Marleni's tasting today and what kind of contrast we're getting with the first coffee. I'm proudly using a spit cup today as it's, a little later in the afternoon. Got to watch the caffeine levels. I really love this coffee.
Yeah. So yeah, off the bat, by contrast, I feel like there's great raspberry sort of flavors in here, and it's very juicy. The mouthfeel is maybe a little bit silkier by contrast. The sort of nice lemon citrus qualities are very long lasting.
Yeah, I really agree.
And sweetness, just...
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a depth of sweetness to this second cup from Marleni Imbachi that I think is singular, and kind of, I definitely prefer the way the sweetness manifests in that cup relative or in comparison to the Divino Nino. I think maybe we talked about this at one of the earlier videos that we were talking about, where I was trying to describe the difference between flavor clarity and flavor complexity.
Right.
So for me, both of these coffees have really pleasant flavor complexity, but there's maybe a bit of a difference in terms of clarity. So I think the Marleni Imbachi has both in spades. So you not only have lots of flavor complexity, but the flavors are very in focus. For me, the Divino Nino has nice complexity, but the flavors are maybe not quite so focused. So for example, I get a citrusy, like a general citrusy quality in Divino Nino, but I get lemon in Marleni Imbachi. And so I think that's sort of like a way of clarifying kind of what we generally mean when we're talking about clarity. And that's why, I think we would both say these are both great coffees, but we would definitely say the Marleni Imbachi, at least for what we look for at Passenger, is on a slightly higher level. And I think there's a variety of potential reasons for that. It's always going to be a little trickier to achieve the peak of quality when you're creating a blend of many different farms, where it's never going to be perfectly homogeneous in terms of the processing. It's also true that sometimes you could have a bit of a gestalt effect as well, where sometimes the sum is a little greater than the parts. But I do think that, there is a clarity to the expression of this variety that a single farm lot from Marleni achieves that isn't quite there in terms of the balance of the Divino Nino. With that said, the Divino Nino is so delightfully tea-like. Yeah. I find it really refreshing in a delightful way. And I think that it definitely sets it apart, whereas I think the Marleni is maybe slightly more syrupy in body, which is also really nice. But I feel like especially we're recording this video kind of in the mid-afternoon, and that tea-like Divino Nino is really hitting the spot for me. Wow. Really nice.
I definitely agree. The fruit flavors are much more in focus here. The sort of raspberry flavor is almost a bit more fresh, fresh and juicy. Whereas with the Divino Nino, it's just a little more subtle.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Great. Well, I think that kind of wraps up the general tasting notes that we wanted to share with you today for these two coffees. Russ, thanks so much for joining the tasting. This was really, really fun. And for all of you who are watching and tasting at home, as always, please reach out to members at passengercoffee.com to share your tasting notes, your thoughts. Let us know, did you have a clear favorite between these coffees? Were there qualities in these different coffees that really jumped out for you? Did you taste similar things to us, or did you find flavors that we completely missed this time? We'd love to hear from you, as always. And we've got 2 really special coffees queued up for next month, so see you then.